What's up guys, Nischal Tube here back with another video. And today we're going to be looking at an economy lesson, public finance. And this video is part 1 of a 3-part series. So now without any further ado, let's get started. So public finance can be divided into 3 components: revenue, expenditure, and debt. There's 2 types of revenue, tax and non-tax, 4 types of expenditure, capital, revenue, planned, non-planned, and debt, internal debt, external debt, productive, unproductive, compulsory, voluntary, redeemable, irredeemable. So we'll be looking into each of these in depth very soon. So the government's role in economy is known as public finance. And if we break it down to the policies of public finance in the government of India, we have the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. So in this video, we'll be primarily focusing on the fiscal policy, and in part 2, we'll be looking at the monetary policy. So the fiscal policy is annually prepared by the Ministry of Finance before the beginning of every fiscal year. Its intention is to manage the expenditure and revenue of the government of India. It's introduced by the finance minister every year in the lower house of parliament. And it's also known as the annual financial statement or budget of the year. And the fiscal policy has a provision in Article 112 of the Constitution of India. So I'll also give you a quick brief about the monetary policy. It's prepared by the Federal Bank of India, or the RBI, Reserve Bank of India. Its purpose is to manage money supply of the country and regulate the banks. And it's released bi-monthly, so either once in 2 months or twice in a month. But in this video, our primary focus will be on fiscal policy. I'll teach you every single aspect of the fiscal policy, and towards the end of the video, we'll be looking at the actual fiscal policy of India for this year and try to break it down from what our understanding is. So the fiscal policy has 2 main components, as I mentioned earlier. Its intention is to manage revenue and expenditure. Revenue is money earned by the government from the public, and expenditure is money spent by the government for the public. So if you notice a pattern here, from the public and for the public. So the revenue that the government earns, they collect it from us, from the public. But they also spend that money that's collected from us for us, which goes with the democratic ideals of the people, for the people, by the people. So the revenue is composed of the earnings of the people, and the expenditure is for the people. So we can use this for any example of a working individual. The revenue is their daily wages or salary, and their expenditure is their monthly spendings for food, water, shelter, etc. Similarly, the government earns money and spends money, as everyone in this world does. So there's a few types of revenue and expenditure, as I briefly touched on earlier in this video. For revenue, there's tax and non-tax, and for expenditure, there's capital expenditure, revenue expenditure, planned expenditure, and non-planned expenditure. So there's tax-based revenue and non-tax-based revenue. So if you guys weren't already aware, we're paying taxes for all government-provided services, and essentially everything, we're paying some sort of tax. So within tax, there's indirect tax, which is tax that's levied on everyday goods and services that we purchase through GST, also known as Goods and Services Tax. And there's direct tax, which is tax collected from our income. So a small portion of our income directly goes to the government as direct tax. So direct tax only applies, and it can only be collected through people that work in the organized sector of the economy. But as of now, the organized sector is only 15% of the actual working population in India, which means that 85% of the working population in India does not pay direct tax, and this could pose as an issue when the government is trying to collect revenue, which is why they also introduced an indirect tax, GST. So regardless of whether you work in the organized sector, unorganized sector, or even a gig job, you have to pay a small, at least 2.5% to the central government and the state government as part of GST. So I'm sure on several receipts of products that you purchased, you see CGST and SGST. That is just your indirect tax that you're paying, the GST. Central government goods and services tax and state goods and services tax. So non-tax-based revenue, there's a few different forms. We have government services. So the government provides several services to its citizens, such as electricity, water supply, telecom, etc. And of course, the government levies a fee on all of these services, so we have to pay our electricity bill, telecom bill, we have to pay these fees. And this comes under non-tax-based revenue, and on top of that, every fee comes with a fine. So if we delay to pay these fee towards government services, we will be fined, and that also comes under non-tax-based revenue. The next form of non-tax-based revenue is interest from loans. So obviously the government provides several loans to new technology-based companies, such as companies based on renewable energy, just to incentivize it, and they collect interest from these loans, and the interest would be their profits. So yet again, another form of non-tax-based revenue. Interest from the loans that the government provides for various projects, activities, and many other things. Also, the government receives profits from PSUs, public sector undertakings, which are essentially enterprises or businesses owned by the government. And if the business is successful, they would obviously receive profits from it. And lastly, foreign aid. So several different countries could provide financial aid to India, or they could invest in India, and these investments or aids during times of disaster or pandemics, like right now, this foreign aid / investment could come in handy as part of the non-tax-based revenue. So, just to sum up real quick, there's two types of revenue, tax-based and non-tax-based. Tax-based, we have indirect tax and direct tax. In non-tax-based, we have government services, fee that's levied on government services, that is, interest from loans provided by the government, profits from PSUs, public sector undertakings, or businesses that are owned by the government, and any foreign aid or investment. So moving on, so you might be wondering, the government is collecting these various different forms of revenue in the form of, it could be assets or cash, and in the end of the day, they're getting money. So where do they store these money? Is there a bank of any sort? Is there any accounts for the government? Well, yes, the government has three accounts: the consolidated fund, the contingency fund, and the public fund. The consolidated fund is the most important, you could say, bank account of the government. So all the taxes collected from the government, they reside in the consolidated fund. And the budget, the annual budget, is usually prepared based on the consolidated fund. So the consolidated fund requires permission. The government of India requires permission for any government officials. They have to receive permission from Parliament to actually withdraw any money from the consolidated fund. And the Comptroller Auditing General, CAG, it typically conducts audits quite often. We also have the contingency fund, which has been defined in Article 267 of the Indian Constitution, and it's about 500 crores, appropriation of money for any unforeseeable instances or unpredictable moments. So any natural disasters or pandemics. We can't predict these events. So knowing that there's a chance of these sort of events happening, the government has set up a contingency fund for any emergencies or any economic slowdowns or even recession. And during these times, the government will withdraw money from the contingency fund. And finally, we have the public fund, which is any public revenue that's not part of consolidated funds. So a few different fees, small profits from different ministries, they all fall under the public fund. The public fund is usually the least important. It just has very few different sources, and it doesn't play that significant of a role. Now keep in mind that each state of India is allowed to have its own similar consolidated fund, contingency fund, and public fund. So just to recap, consolidated fund is the main bank account of India, the Indian government that is, and it contains the various taxes collected, and typically the budget is prepared from the consolidated fund, and any government official requires permission from the parliament. It has to be voted on in parliament to receive or to withdraw money from the consolidated fund. So typically, when you're preparing the budget, there's something called the appropriation bill for the year. And that is considered as a money bill. So you have to vote on it in the lower house of the parliament, Lok Sabha. And the only way to prepare the budget is if you get permission or approval from the government, or the parliament in this case. If you get approval from parliament to withdraw money from the consolidated fund for the budget purposes, or this will come under the appropriation bill. And you can only withdraw money from the consolidated fund if and only if you receive approval from parliament. The contingency fund and public fund, you do not require any permission or approval from the government or the Parliament of India. So, for those of you who are wondering, where does the government store all this revenue? I hope your question has been answered now. Moving on. So, expenditure. We talked about the two types of revenue. Now let's look at the four types of expenditure. We have capital expenditure and revenue expenditure. So capital expenditure is any expenditure towards long-term assets. Examples include building schools, airports, and hospitals. So obviously, building schools, airports, and hospitals, they will most definitely reap profits in the future. Because in order to build human resource for the future, we should be educating and providing healthcare to all the children of today. And building airports and modern public transportation methods, such as, yes, airports, metros, subway system, bullet trains in the future. These will increase the connectivity between different places and, of course, increase the economic productivity of the country as a whole. So capital expenditure is any expenditure made towards long-term assets. So, for example, if we think about it from a household perspective, capital expenditure would be the parents spending money on the children by providing them with quality food, quality water, quality shelter, quality education, and quality healthcare to the best of their ability. And the reason they're spending this money is they're hoping that this expenditure will reap profits in the future. And this expenditure will enable the children to be successful in the future. So in the government perspective, they're thinking of the society as a whole. So they're building schools, airports, hospitals to increase the productivity, which will increase the GDP or economic growth in the future, and developing human resource in the children, which will again reap profits in the future. So all of this would come under capital expenditure. So we also have revenue expenditures. So these are day-to-day expenses, and it doesn't create any assets or it doesn't reap any profits in the future. So paying salaries to government employees and paying interest, giving out pensions, these are not creating any assets, and they're not really building any human resource, and of course they won't reap any profits, because once you give the salary to a person or you give a pension to a person, I mean, no one knows what they'll do with them. There's no confirmed building of assets. So we can't call this wasted expenditure, because all the employees are working for salaries and all the employees retired for pensions. So really, it's a requirement. And of course, the government they also get a loan from various different, it could be different countries or the RBI, and they have to pay interest on these loans too. So that's the difference between capital and revenue expenditure. So planned and non-planned expenditure are also similar, but they're slightly different in a few ways, which I'll explain right now. So planned expenditure is any expenditure that increases productivity of the economy through various different aspects. So rural development, education, improvement of healthcare standards. So the common example would be all the union schemes, so the midday meal scheme, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Expenditure on these different schemes are most definitely beneficial to the people living in the backward areas of society that still don't have these basic amenities as you and I have. And so by enabling these rural areas to produce goods and services as we are in the urban cities, we're obviously increasing economic growth, economic productivity, which is why planned expenditure is always encouraged, and all the union schemes are funded by planned expenditure. And non-planned expenditure is also similar to revenue expenditure. It doesn't increase the productivity, and it's the same example to payment of salaries, interests, pensions, etc. So you might have noticed already, capital expenditure and planned expenditure are very similar, and revenue expenditure and non-planned expenditure are also similar. So capital and planned expenditure, they're building assets, they're increasing productivity, and they'll reap profits in the future. Whereas revenue expenditure and non-planned expenditure, they don't increase any productivity, they will not reap profits in the future, they don't build any assets, and they're just day-to-day expenses that the government is obliged to fulfill. So before moving on to actually looking at the Indian fiscal policy, here are a few important terms that you should know to actually understand the document. So receipts, that's revenue, another word for revenue, and disbursements, it's another word for expenditure. So in the document that I'm about to show you, if you happen to see the words receipts or disbursements, don't be afraid, it's just another word for revenue and expenditure. We also have actuals, budget estimates, and revised estimates. So actuals are the actual amount of money that the government spent that year or the year before. The budget estimates are the amount of money that the government is planning to spend in the upcoming fiscal year. And the revised estimates take place halfway through the year. And so once the government has a good idea of what that year has to bring, perhaps there's some disaster or recession period, then they will revise the estimates that they made earlier to provide a more plausible budget statement, a more feasible budget statement. So for example, so the budget is usually prepared before the fiscal year begins, so before October 19th, 2019, the budget was introduced, and they had some budget estimates for the 2019-20 fiscal year. And no one predicted COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, so perhaps maybe in March, April, or May, obviously the financial ministry sat down and they revised the earlier estimates that they made to make their budget more feasible and avoid deficit, which we'll be talking about in the next video. So now, Let's try to revise all that we know and implement our current knowledge through this video and look at the annual financial statement or the Indian fiscal policy for 2019 to 2020. Alright guys, so now let's look at the actual fiscal policy of India. The latest fiscal policy of India, also known as the annual financial statement. So in the top we can see statement 1, Consolidated Fund of India. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, the budget is prepared from the Consolidated Fund of India. So that's clearly defined up here. And then it says the revenue account. So this is about revenue, receipts. So receipts are, as I mentioned earlier, the revenue. So we're getting some tax revenue here. Corporation tax, tax on income, hotel receipts, interest tax, fringe benefit tax. So obviously, both you and I don't understand all of these terms, but we at least know the basic idea. So obviously, there's tax revenue, as I mentioned, and it looks like the budget estimates are around 1,306,000 crores, the estimates, whereas the actuals are only around 1,125,046. So there's a deficit here. And then taxes on property and capital transactions, estate duty, taxes on wealth, security transactions. These are all tax-based revenue, and we also have the actuals from 2018 to 2019. We have the budget estimates for this year, the revised estimates halfway across the year, and the budget estimates for 2020 to 21. So you can see that from 2018 to 2019, the actual revenue from taxes on property and capital transactions was 11,568 crores. Whereas the budget estimates for the following year was 12,800. So we see an increase in revenue, which is good for the government and the people. But the revised estimate around halfway through the year, mid-year, it goes down by 300 crores. So 12,500 crores. And then the budget estimates for 2021, the revenue is 13,000 crores from taxes on property and capital transactions. So taxes on commodities and services, so this is where all the GST comes in. It looks like the actual for 2018 to 2019 was 941,035 crores. The estimate for the following year was 1,122,015 crores. The revised estimate for that year, so mid-year of 2019 to 2020 fiscal year, was 98,924. So the revised estimate was, so you can see a growing pattern here. Revised estimates are lower than the actual budget estimates, which is a good sign. So we're planning for higher revenue, but we're actually receiving less. So in the case of revenue, this would be bad. But for expenditure, this is a good thing. And the budget estimates for this year, this fiscal year, upcoming fiscal year, 2020-2021, we have 1,099,520. So you keep going on gross tax revenue. And now finally, we're here at B, non-tax revenue. So fiscal, government services, interest, general services, defense services. These are all government provided services, and we're getting revenue from these, of course. So it could be fee or anything. And then also we have another category, so grants and contributions. It could be foreign aid, etc. So obviously I don't expect you guys to know these. But overall, we have a general term, and we can actually read this document and understand it from the top. So for revenue, we have the tax revenue and the non-tax revenue. And these are just all various different categories of revenue. And it comes down to the actual revenue from 2018 to 2019 was 2,261,570 crores. And the budget estimate was 2,733,541. The revised estimate was 2,653,764, and the budget estimate for this upcoming fiscal year is 2,940,739 crores. So this concludes the revenue part of the government. So it's safe to say that annually the government is earning nearly 2,900,000 crores from various different sources, tax, non-tax, and grants, and aid and contributions. So this concludes revenue. Now let's move on to the disbursements, also known as expenditure. So now we're moving on to what the government is spending. So we're spending on the organs of state, general services here, social services, economic services, and grants and in-aid contributions. So although the terms that we talked about didn't appear here, so it's not exactly capital expenditure, revenue expenditure, we can still make out a basic idea. So the general services. So the government spending for the parliament, the president, the council of ministers, administration of justice, elections, and auditing. So obviously the government spending money to allow these different organizations, bodies, and processes to function properly. And it also requires some money to collect tax. So we have to pay interest, administrative services, salaries, pensions. We have to invest in defense. So that could be purchasing missiles or other arms and weapons. We have to spend on general education. So this is where we kind of see our capital expenditure or our planned expenditure. We have to spend on education, sports and youth services, art and culture, medical and public health, water supply and sanitation, urban development, information and publicity, broadcasting, welfare of scheduled caste tribes, other backward classes and minorities, labor, employment. So obviously these are various different spendings that are for the benefit of, it could be, in this case, for welfare of scheduled caste, we're spending 5,343 crores, which is great. All this money is going towards empowering them through different schemes or activities or programs. We're also spending on economic services, so rural development, as I mentioned earlier, flood control, energy, industry and minerals, transportation. So these are all various different forms of capital expenditure. So some you can consider as revenue expenditure or unplanned expenditure, non-productive. So paying the salaries for these people, collecting taxes, interest payment. Those are typically come under our revenue or unplanned expenditure. Whereas these, investing in our army, social services, economic services, these special area programs, so empowering the northeastern areas. MP's local area development scheme. So this is one of those union schemes I was talking about. It comes under the planned expenditure. Energy to power the country and increase productivity. Industry and minerals. Villages and small industries. Empowering MSMEs to contribute greater to the overall economy of the country. Transport. Increasing connectivity between locations. So we have all these different improving road transport. Science and technology, investing in the future, guys. These are very important investments. These are a few unplanned, non-productive. So tourism, foreign trade, export. This could be either way. Yeah, that concludes it. So now you understood the concept, and I showed you the actual fiscal policy of India. As you can see, you can just visit india.budget.gov.in and you can find the PDF as I've done here. And you've applied your knowledge to understand the official budget document, the official annual financial statement of India, which is, in my opinion, a great feat, a great accomplishment. And really, to understand this, you only need to understand a few different terms: revenue, expenditure, and then different kinds of revenue and expenditure, and that's it. So the fiscal policy is very easy to understand once you know these terms. But if we think about it in the perspective of a layman who doesn't know about any of these terms, this would look like Greek and Latin to him. So, I hope this video has empowered you and enabled you to understand this important financial document. And through this video, you can also look at fiscal policies of various different countries and get an understanding of that as well. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a lot in this video. And until the next video, this is Nischal signing off. Peace.